This is Mental Health with Gregory Scott Brown, MD, a podcast devoted to exploring innovative ideas from unlikely advocates for mental wellness. Let us work together to reduce stigma, broaden access to care, and bridge gaps in understanding by refusing to shy away from difficult conversations. In this pursuit, we can promote natural and accessible wellness moving forward. Thank you for joining. Here is Gregory Scott Brown.
Since 2006, Nityda Gessel has served as a yoga educator working within the intersections of yoga, mental health, embodied activism, and community advocacy. Nityda is a licensed somatic psychotherapist, trauma specialist, speaker, writer, and heart-centered activist. Devoted to bringing yoga to underserved populations, Nityda has taught yoga in trauma clinics, child and adolescent and adult psychiatric hospital units, drug and alcohol rehabilitation centers, public and private schools, and integrated with talk therapy in her private psychotherapy practice. Nityda is the founder of the Trauma Conscious Yoga Institute, whose mission is to make embodied trauma-informed care more inclusive and accessible for trauma survivors within clinical and non-clinical settings, and to provide survivors with a safe, supportive space to reclaim their bodies and empower their own healing and trauma resolution. Nityda created the Trauma Conscious Yoga Method, a healing modality that marries trauma-informed yoga with somatic psychotherapy practices to inspire survivors to compassionately explore their bodies' narratives for ultimate growth and evolution beyond their pasts. Nityda facilitates trainings in the Trauma Conscious Yoga Method online and across the United States for mental health professionals, yoga teachers, helping professionals, and survivors interested in learning skills to support their resiliency. I'm here with Nityda Gessel at the Soma Vida Wellness Center in Austin, Texas. Nityda, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Gregory.
I've really been looking forward to this because you and I, we have a lot in common. We're both yoga teachers, we're yogis, and we're also mental health professionals. Yeah. Talk a little bit about your journey as a yoga teacher and your parallel journey in mental health.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. So yoga, my personal path in yoga is that yoga, when I found it in my early 20s, I was about 21 years old when I started to practice with steadiness, and it was so instrumental in me kind of progressing in my own mental health journey. I was in recovery from trauma and eating disorder and dealing with a lot of addictive conditioned patterns, and yoga was something that really helped me formulate a new relationship with my body and become more embodied. The philosophy of yoga supported me in having a framework for how to live a life that was compassionate and peaceful, but one that was also fueled by connection to others and service. And it was like a form of therapy for me, which I really needed at the time. I had come from a career as a professional ballet dancer, so in looking for something to support my healing journey at the time, I knew about talk therapy, and I knew I actually wanted to be a therapist, but I knew that for me, personally, talking wasn't going to be enough, because as a dancer, my way of expressing myself was always through my body. So yoga was this beautiful resource for me that really supported and kind of jump-started my healing path. I unexpectedly ended up teaching not long after I started practicing. It was about 4 months in, I found myself in a teacher training. And I was also getting a master's in psychology at the time. So having yoga had supported my mental health so much, and then also, journeying toward becoming a mental health professional, it was inevitable that those two fields were tied together for me. And so I knew that, just like personally, I knew that I needed to heal through my body. I knew that as a clinician, once I got there, I would use yoga as a way to empower other people to heal as well. I knew that talking just wasn't going to be it. And so here we are today.
Yeah, and I think that's great. And, you speak about being a ballet dancer before you went into, the mental health professions.
Right, yeah.
And many people know I studied at the Juilliard School. I was a classical musician. I was an oboist.
Yeah.
And for me, I started doing yoga when I was in medical school. And there was something about it that was just grounding for me. And it didn't matter what was going on in school or how busy my day was. When I found myself on my mat in the yoga studio, it seemed like nothing else mattered.
Yeah, that's amazing.
It took me 10 years before I actually did the yoga teacher training, so you're a little bit quicker to it than I was. But again, you know, for me, yoga is quintessential in my work, my philosophy in psychiatry. So how does yoga influence your practice as a mental health professional?
Sure. You know, because, so at this point, I've been teaching for 13 years, and I think yoga really helped to form the adult that I am today, because I found it when I was 21, very early in my adulthood, at a time when I felt very lost, and it kind of became my guiding light. It became like my mother, my father, my religion, it became everything for me, right? So it's kind of like I can't separate myself from the practice, even if I wanted to. So even without trying, in a sense, when I'm working with people clinically, yoga is seeping in some way, because it just informs the person that I am. And that's like even unconscious. Now, consciously, I think that yoga is an incredible therapeutic tool, so I do intentionally bring it in as well to support people, because, you know, there's many different layers to the practice, which I'm sure we'll get to, but there's more than just the physical practice of yoga, right? There's the breathing, which most clients, when they come in, I'm sure you've experienced this, they are not grounded or in their bodies. They're dealing with a lot of anxiety, or they're more sympathetic nervous system dominant. They're very go, go, go. And so just the breathing practices that we do in yoga themselves are supportive to clients and helping them get grounded and centered. You know, but also I work mostly with trauma, as you know. And so trauma is I don't like to use the word disorder. It's an experience that lives in the body and is manifested through the body. And so we have to use a body inclusive modality to support trauma. So that's where the physical practice of yoga comes in and marries very nicely with talk therapy. It allows clients an ability to be with sensation in their bodies and explore that from a place of compassion, and then release that. You have to move toward it to move through it. And yoga is beautiful for that. Yeah.
I completely agree with that. And this idea of breathing, I was talking to a colleague a few days ago who's been practicing for several years, and he mentioned the observation that breathing is not something that we learn anymore to share with our patients. And it's a simple thing, this idea of this, pranayama breath that we just don't share with our patients, and it's quite powerful. How do you feel about this idea?
Yeah, I mean, you think like breathing is something that we automatically do. If we weren't breathing, we wouldn't be alive. But at the same time, most people are not cognizant of if they're breathing, how they're breathing, or maybe don't even know the power that comes from stopping and taking 3 deep breaths. So yeah, there's so much power in breathing in general. And I also like to educate people around why it's helpful, what's going on in your body. You're regulating your nervous system, you're getting yourself out of a fight or flight state to a calm, peaceful, relaxed state through your breath. And so it's like one of the best resources for people to kind of ground themselves and have control over their bodies. Yeah, it's paramount.
And there's nothing woo-woo about this. This is science we're talking about,
right?
Right?
Science, yeah.
And I think that's important that, we and the mental health professions who are also yogis are able to share that with our colleagues who are looking for evidence. I mean, these are things that have been around a long time.
Right, yeah. And I'm all about the woo-woo too, but yeah, this is actual science, right? And it's just the way that our physiology works, which is what resonates with a lot more people than the woo-woo piece. So yeah, for sure.
And so, Nityda, I mean, you've been instrumental in my journey and helping me deepen my own understanding in yoga. It was in this very building a few months ago downstairs that I took your course in the trauma conscious yoga method. And that was a very enriching and enlightening experience for me, just learning a different approach. I mean, we hear about EMDR, we hear about cognitive processing therapy, and just being able to have another tool in our toolbox to help patients, especially patients or clients who have sustained trauma. Talk a little bit more about how you view yoga as a therapeutic modality to help people who have gone through trauma.
Sure, yeah. And first, I'm just really touched by you saying that. I'm so glad it was a positive experience for you. That's why I do this. So that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and I kind of started to get here a little bit earlier around the way that trauma is created is that it's a bottom-up process. So it goes into the body first before it gets to the brain. So trauma is stored in a very disorganized, scattered way, which is why it's so confusing and upsetting in the aftermath. But a lot of trauma is stored in the body. It's stored deep in the connective tissue. We have implicit memory, which is body memory. And implicit memory, for those who don't know, you can think about, how do you know how to ride a bike, right? You learn how to ride a bike once, and then you pretty much know for the rest of your life. You don't have to think about it. It's not cognitive. That's your body's implicit memory. Well, trauma is stored in that same way. So we now know through research and evidence that you cannot simply do a cognitive therapy to resolve trauma. You can talk about it all you want. You can create all these narratives around it, but that's not going to resolve it. You have to do something that involves the body. So yoga, there's yoga researchers and scientists, and there's a debate because it's so old around how old yoga is, but it's something like 5,000 to 10,000 years old, yoga is. So I like to say that yoga is the oldest somatic psychotherapy. It's been around for forever. There's a whole philosophy and science behind it. And like I said, with my personal experience, it's the physical practice that can help us discharge stuck trauma from our body, but it's also the philosophy that is so supportive to people's mental functioning as well, right? There's this philosophy of compassion, loving kindness, acceptance, being a witness to your experience instead of over-identifying or attaching to it. There's so much richness that comes from yoga in its ability to inherently heal trauma, and also it's just supportive for pretty much overall mental health for anybody, even if you're not in recovery from trauma.
I completely agree with that, and I can recall working with a patient just last week, in a cognitive processing therapy session, which is completely evidence-based, and I think it works well for many, many patients. I'm fully supportive of that in a certain group of patients, but in this particular patient, just the worksheets were kind of overwhelming for this person, and during the session, we just stopped, and I asked the patient, tell me what you're feeling, where do you feel the trauma in your body, and we spent some time, breathing through that, and it really resonated with this person. And I think that's what the trauma conscious yoga method is all about.
Yeah, for sure. And what you said makes me think too about, I know for me in my personal journey, I didn't have the words from my experience. And that's so true for most people, because when trauma happens, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that makes meaning of things, that logically puts things together, is totally offline. So it's very hard to have language for your experience, oftentimes until you're further along your healing journey. Plus, a lot of trauma happens in early childhood, or it's pre-verbal. There's no language for that, but your body remembers what happened. And one of the beautiful things about yoga too is that we don't have to get so stuck in our personal narrative as we're healing, because getting stuck in that can actually do more damage sometimes than it does good. We can just feel it in our body and let it release. And there's different things we can do with that, but we don't have to overanalyze so much what's happening. We can feel it and sense into it and explore it and let it go.
What does a trauma conscious yoga session look like?
Well, that's a good question, and it could really look different based on how many people, is this the individual session or a group, and who is doing the session. But most typically, what it'll look like if I'm doing a trauma-informed yoga session with somebody, because I'm also a licensed psychotherapist, I do integrate some psychotherapeutic stuff in there, right? So it's not just yoga, but it's probably mostly yoga. But, you can think about the different styles of yoga that there are. If people aren't familiar, there's many different styles of yoga. So there are styles like vinyasa or power yoga, where you move through things very quickly, And then there's styles like yin and restorative where you hold poses for longer. So typically, everybody's different, every client's different, but typically when I'm working with somebody, it'll be more of a yin style practice. So I'll have people hold a pose for anywhere from 3 to 8 minutes so that they can really be with a sensation, and I'll support them in exploring the sensations that they're feeling. They might give it a measure from 0 to 10. How intense is it? Because people will notice that the intensity changes. Is there an emotion to go with that sensation? So by holding a pose for longer, there's a lot that you can do therapeutically there. And sessions tend to stay pretty close to the ground with people. We don't do a lot standing up, although we might. So it's kind of like a more grounded, gentle, focused session with some integration of some different somatic psychotherapy practices as well.
Right, and when you're talking about a group yoga session that's trauma-informed, really you're talking about adapting the environment as well.
Yes, definitely.
What might that look like compared to a traditional yoga class?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for asking that. Yeah, so there's certain tenets or principles within the trauma-informed yoga vantage that make a class trauma-informed versus what you might otherwise see. So language is so important in a trauma-informed class. When we're in the seat of yoga teacher, we're in a position of power, and in that power seat, the language we use can really do harm to other people, or it can uplift them and empower them. So we're really conscious of language, and language is really invitational. So rather than demanding somebody do something, or there's no use of the word now, it's always like, if you'd like to, when you're ready to. It's always invitational, because what happens when you've been traumatized? Usually your choice was taken away from you, right? Or always your choice was taken away. So really in a trauma-informed class, we're giving people a choice, and we're giving them a voice by doing that. So language is one, and there's just really a mindful awareness about everything that could potentially be triggering to somebody who is a trauma survivor, especially if they have actual PTSD or acute trauma symptoms. So another example, I'll just give you one more, is, sometimes a teacher will walk around the room while they're teaching, even when students are laying on their back and their eyes are closed and the room is dark. There's nothing wrong with that. But from a trauma-informed vantage, if somebody's hypervigilant or scared because they were attacked, we wouldn't walk around the room. We wouldn't have the room super dark anyway. We might have it dim, but we wouldn't have it too dark. We wouldn't walk around the room without letting students know that that's what we're doing. We always want to tell the students exactly what we're doing so they're in the know, so we don't have the power and they don't, that we're on a level playing field as much as is possible.
And standing in a circle is something that you had us do in our training. I thought that was unique.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit more about that.
Sure, yeah. So when I teach a trauma-informed class, I like to have us in a circle because it's less exposing, right? You could think about when you're in rows, somebody's in the front row, and then, pretty much everybody can be visible from the back side unless you're in the very back row, right? And so a lot of people who have experienced trauma have experienced sexual trauma, or also even if you were in the military and you got attacked from the back or something, right? Like, it's not comfortable for a lot of people to have others behind them. So when you're in a circle, nobody's behind you. Everybody can see everybody else, and that can create such a felt sense of safety collectively.
There are skeptics who are listening to this right now. What would you say to them?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I guess it would depend on what the reason is, but what I have to say is that teaching from this vantage is a choice. And I don't think that if we're talking about yoga teachers specifically, not every yoga teacher has to teach from a trauma-informed vantage. I think, given the percentage of people in our society that have PTSD, as a yoga teacher in a class of 20 people, there's going to be at least 2 people in there who have PTSD. So for me, that's enough for me to want to be mindful about teaching in a way that is supportive. For me, I want to do as little harm to people and really create a space where people can heal and feel good about themselves. That's what the world needs right now. But, to each their own. And sometimes you have to meet people where they're at. And, my thing is like explore resistance. So if you're a skeptic and you're resistant toward this for whatever reason, you could just explore that some more and figure out why that is.
And I would offer, let's just to add to that, let's offer treatments, the best treatment possible that helps the patient.
Right.
And let's forget about everything else. If it's not harming the patient, and with trauma-informed yoga, I wouldn't call it an evidence-based practice or standard of care practice yet. There is a growing body of evidence to support its utility. But if it's something that we have that can help our patients, why not offer it to them? And I think that's what this is all about. Now, I'm fascinated, just to pivot a little bit, about your ideas with yoga and social justice. I had never heard this before, and I think it's just a beautiful thing to say or to talk about. I had heard before, or I can understand, when you say that Gandhi was a yogi, but I had never heard someone say that, hey, Martin Luther King Jr. was a bhakti yogi. That was news to me. But then when you explained a little bit about your philosophy behind making that statement, I completely got it. Talk a little bit more about what you meant by that.
Sure. So you're referring to a part very early on in the training where we're going over the origins of yoga, and we're talking about the different types of yoga. So in the West, we have a very narrow view of what yoga is, and that in and of itself is a societal kind of social justice issue because it's cultural appropriation and it's all these things, but we sell fitness and beauty in America. So what we know about yoga is the physical practice, which supposedly, is going to get you fit and beautiful. But the physical practice, which we call asana, is only one small piece of the yogic practice. You do not have to actually be doing asana to be a yogi, right? So that's the other thing. Some people get that there are other pieces to the practice, but they think to be doing yoga, I need to be on a mat. No, you don't. My dad was a Raja yogi. Raja yogis, they focus on the Yoga Sutras, which is a text written by a sage named Patanjali, and they meditate, right? And they're yogis, and they don't do the physical practice necessarily. So then there's this other framework of yoga or pathway of yoga called Bhakti Yoga, which is the yoga of heart-centered devotion. And a lot of the times people will refer to Bhakti Yoga in the related to chanting and playing instruments and like kirtan or call and response, singing or chanting. But Bhakti is heart-centered devotion. So when you're on a Bhakti Yoga path, that means you are doing work that is your heart's work, and you are absolutely devoted to doing that work, right? So I use Martin Luther King Jr. as an example because even though, to my knowledge, he didn't call himself a yogi, he certainly knew his dharma or life purpose, and he was on a mission to bring about change, and it was from a place of love and from his heart. So absolutely, in my mind, Martin Luther King Jr. is a Bhakti, or was a Bhakti yogi.
I think that's great. And the broader idea to take away from this is that yoga is something that is inviting. Yoga is something that is for everyone.
Right.
Now, on the flip side of that, you also point out that in the popular press, in the print media, and social media, the image of yoga has almost morphed into this idea of this skinny, Caucasian, upper middle class woman. And yoga, I mean, when you really think about it, like we were talking about earlier, yoga means so much more than that. I can recall recently on the cover of the Yoga Journal, they did a set of covers actually, and one of them showed a middle-aged African-American man. One of the other covers showed a woman in military uniform, and they were, they were assuming yoga postures. And I thought, this is great. This is beautiful. And the subtitle in the magazine was, quote, "The future of yoga." And in my view, this has always been yoga. It's not the future of yoga, right? So how do you feel about this idea?
Yeah, well, I think Yoga Journal maybe is starting to get the message. Maybe they've had enough people speak out about it that they're realizing they need to put somebody on the cover other than, like you said, a Caucasian, blonde-haired, upper-middle-class white woman who is thin and in a cisgendered body, you know, because that is really what the majority of the hundreds of Yoga Journal covers has been over the years since Yoga Journal has been in existence. And it's a reflection of, again, privilege in our society, who are the privileged people, and it's sending a message of who is deserving of these practices, right? And so myself, I talk about it a lot. There's a lot of social justice advocates in the yoga community who have been talking about this even for longer than I am. So I think it's so wonderful that maybe Yoga Journal is getting the message. There have been people of color on the cover before, but it's just been sprinkled here and there every once in a while. So 2 covers in a row, maybe they're starting to get, you know, I mean, who knows? I mean, the one of the woman in the military uniform, she's still very flexible, very thin, but she's in a military uniform. So maybe they're referring to trauma in some way. I don't know. I'm curious to see where they go with it, and hopefully they continue to put, you know, a diversity of beautiful bodies on the cover that are not that same homogenous group that we always see.
Right, yeah. I agree. And I think that's great. And I was encouraged by that cover, just to say the least. And I hope they keep it up, because I completely agree with you.
Me too.
Now, I advocate for green psychiatry. You'll hear me talk about this. This is essentially my thing, and it's an initiative that invites what some may call alternative practices, like yoga, into the therapeutic space. Psychiatry can work alongside massage and acupuncture and yoga therapists. How do you feel about this idea of green psychiatry?
I'm in love with it. I think it's amazing. I think, you know, I have a very integrative approach, and I think that's the way to go. I think, you know, traditionally a lot of these Western therapeutic modalities come from a framework of pathologizing people and treating symptoms. But the more holistic practices like yoga, Reiki, energy work, you know, nutrition, a lot of the times it's more preventative and looking at what's the root of this and what can we do to support a wholly healthy human being. So I think there's beauty from the Eastern practices and there's beauty from the West, and to marry the two and to have psychiatrists working close with massage therapists, I think hopefully that's the wave of the future. You know, I'm all for it. I'm so supportive of it. Yeah,
I think that's great. Now, in the inaugural episode of this podcast, This is Mental Health, it featured actually a yoga teacher, Joel Hame, who was really gracious in accepting my invitation, because I had no idea what I was doing with the podcast. It took me about 20 minutes to set the microphone up. But I thought he was really great, you know, on that podcast, and he talked about the importance of just moving our bodies in maintaining overall health and wellness. And so my question for you is, what can we do as a whole? What would you recommend from your standpoint to improve mental wellness in the community?
Yeah, wow. That is that's a loaded question. So much. I mean, and I think it's because where we are in our world right now is that we're in a place where we're very divided, it can seem a lot of the times. And so the practice of yoga means union, right? So it's one, uniting with yourself, right? Getting close to yourself, to your highest good. And then it's union with other people, like recognizing the highest good in them. Right, so I think both of these parallel processes have to take place. And I think when we're able to get deep into our own practice, then we can recognize that we're more alike, we're more similar to other people than we are different. So division, oppression, privilege, all of these things disembody us. So when we get back in our body and we experience love for our body, then we realize everybody is in a body, you know, everyone is connected. And so we have to do our own work and get on our own mat and do our own movement, right? But then we need to go out into the world and be of service, right? And that's the social justice piece. The Buddha didn't go find enlightenment on his own and then never come back into the world. He did that, and then he came back to teach others and to be an agent for change. And that's what we have to do. So it's not just about moving around, feeling good in your body. For you, that would be a very ego-driven practice. And yoga is about dismantling the ego. So we can find our peace on our own mat by moving and getting healthy. But then we need to go out into the community and be of service. And there's so many ways you can do that. You can volunteer. You can start having conversations with people who have different beliefs than you. And once you're strong in your yoga practice and you know how to tolerate discomfort, it's easier to have a conversation with somebody who has opposing beliefs than you. Like, these conversations need to be happening. So, there's so much. That's such a loaded question, but I hope that answers it a little bit.
I think that is a wonderful
Yeah.
answer, and again, just focusing on the union that yoga offers, I think is a great step forward.
Right, because I will say, like, it can really be spiritual bypass to say something like, oh, love and light, namaste, we're all one, but you don't actually go out into the world and do anything to change the very clear disparity that exists between people of different races and ethnicities, between people who are cisgendered and not. There's a clear difference between the way people are treated and what happens to them in their life journey based on which groups they're placed into. So love and light, namaste, we're all one. That's beautiful, but now you need to go out there and do something, because it's not how we're all being treated, like we're all one. Yeah.
And finally, Nityda, what are you up to these days?
Oh my goodness. Well, professionally or
professionally,
okay.
personally,
yeah,
whatever.
Well, personally, I'm about to go pick up my husband from the airport. He's getting back from London, so that's exciting. But professionally, I have a lot going on, because that's what I do, is offer things. So the most recent or soon to be here offering that I'm giving is a webinar. I don't know when this is going to air, but it's going to be on Wednesday, December 19th. So people are more than welcome to join that if this episode has aired before that. It's a free webinar. Everybody is welcome. You don't have to be a mental health professional or a yoga teacher, but it's on yoga for attachment repair and trauma resolution. And then, I lead my trauma conscious yoga method teacher trainings. So I have one coming up in Brooklyn in January, one here in Austin in January.
And I would encourage anyone to take that if they can. I think it's just wonderful.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I've really tried to, a lot of mental health professionals come, but there's a parallel process that happens in that training where you're doing your own healing work. So even if you're not a helping professional, it could still be so beneficial. I'll just give you one other thing that I'm doing. So the training is also now available online. There's an online version, so that has launched. So people who do not live in one of the cities where I'm going to facilitate the training could do it online with me, and that's available as well.
Well, thank you, Nityda, for such an informative conversation. I'm so happy we were able to speak today.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. The increasing popularity of yoga in the United States has offered millions of people an opportunity to stop and breathe. Between 2012 and 2016, the number of Americans practicing yoga grew by 50%, and there are currently over 6,000 yoga studios in the United States. The benefits of yoga are well documented and include tempering chronic pain, mitigating insomnia, alleviating anxiety, managing depression, and helping people in their journey to overcome the vestiges of trauma. Let us not forget that the word yoga represents union, which means that inclusivity is at its very essence. Yoga has a place for us all. To Nityda Gessel, thank you for a remarkable discussion. And to the listeners, thank you for joining. Stay well.
This discussion is not intended to replace professional medical advice, and views of guests are their own. If you're struggling with suicidal thoughts, get help immediately or call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. Gregory Scott Brown, MD, is a resident in general psychiatry at the Dell Medical School, a fellow with the Academy of Integrative Health and Medicine, and author of the blog Green Psychiatry in Psychology Today. Follow him on Facebook or Twitter at Gregory S. Brown, MD, or visit his website at gregoryscottbrown.com.